Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel. Sasquatch are real. Oh yes, we all know that. And it's just so fabulous to have you joining my channel today and listening to my story. I just want to say I appreciate each and every one of you so very much. And I just love my subscribers. You guys all rock. You're all one of a kind. So let's get started with tonight's story, which you're really going to like. I do wonder how many of you know about Appalachian moonshine. Well, this did in fact have a very negative effect on a person in our story, very tragically. But it's a very interesting story and I know you're going to love it. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Andrea and I guess you could call me a typical hillbilly, as I've lived in Appalachia virtually all my life, and growing up I was one among 3 children, the only girl in our family home. My mother got married when she was 17 years old, and the marriage sadly only lasted a few months after my father finally just abandoned us, and my parents subsequently divorced. He worked for about $1 a day in a sawmill. I never felt angry towards my father for abandoning us, because he was only about 21 when he did actually abscond. And I think he left us because raising a family at the time, at such a young age, with so little money, was not fun for a young man in his prime of life, who had not only even begun to live yet. I gather he left Appalachia and went to live in Kansas. Personally, I doubt I would have ever coped with raising a family at such a young age myself, so I'm hardly in a position to cast stones at him. Even so, I would love to know what became of him, and whether he did end up having some children, because I might have some half-siblings floating around somewhere. As you can imagine, life was exceedingly hard for a young girl like my mother, raising 4 rambunctious children like ourselves, and believe me, we were a handful, always getting ourselves into all kinds of trouble, and we just loved pranking just about everyone. We would do the most horrendous things like stuffing our grandmother's handbag with frogs, so when it came to giving collection at church on a Sunday morning, and she began to open her purse, all these frogs would go hopping around the church, and some people would scream frantically with shock, because there were literally hundreds of these frogs darting around everywhere. Another time we would put a couple of snails on our pastor's domed hat that he would wear during a church service, and we would be laughing hysterically when the pastor got up to do the sermon, with snails wiggling around on his hat, and everyone in the congregation was laughing so very much, and the humorless pastor was so happy because he'd never ever seen the congregation so animated by one of his services before. We managed to retrieve the snails without him ever knowing, and for years after the event he would always ask his wife what it was that he had said during the service to arouse such humour among the congregation. I don't believe she ever had the heart to actually tell him. We had a very simple basic life growing up, and lived in a very small square bricked house that my father had built, and really consisted mainly of a kitchen and 4 bedrooms and a living room. We lived without all the modern amenities people have today, although there are parts of Appalachia still today that live in the dark ages without any power. We had no juice, which in Appalachia literally means no power and electricity, and in those days we would get around with a horse and buggy, or otherwise we would walk everywhere by foot, so there was no need for a gym in those days because we were naturally fit. We would help my mother by growing vegetables during the summer months with the assistance of a horse and plough. We would then can all our food for the winter months. We would also go coon, squirrel and rabbit hunting, and we would eat the meat as food, and believe me, the meat was always tender and delicious, and my mother was a marvellous cook, so she knew how to turn the toughest cuts of meat into culinary masterpieces. My mother eventually got remarried to a very gentle giant called Bert. He was a very likeable, easy kind of guy whom we all warmed to immediately, because he had a very good sense of humour and a kind heart, but unfortunately he got caught up in the moonshine business, so there were times when he was never ever sober. One of the locals actually taught him how to make maize and sugar and distill his own alcohol, and from that moment on there was no looking back for him. Luckily, he was not an obnoxious drunk, but he was not good at dealing with alcohol in any way, and he would end up stumbling around the place completely off his head. The trouble with that moonshine is that it is clear like water, and a few sips of that stuff is pretty lethal and far worse than vodka. Growing up, I would say the natural world was pretty much our playground, and my brother and I had a very good life, and we always found ways to entertain ourselves, and the views around our home were exquisitely beautiful, and we were surrounded by mountainous valleys, beautiful open pastures, silvery lakes, ponds, gravel pits, rocky outcrops, and ubiquitous areas of forest that literally stretch back for hundreds of miles. Our area consisted of all the usual animals that you get in Appalachia, and we had regular visits from black bears that would sometimes even poke their heads through the front door as if to say hello at us, but luckily a lone gunshot usually got them to run away pretty fast. One day my brother and I decided to go exploring in a mountainous valley that was really a very big challenge to climb, but growing up with brothers, I was naturally desirous of always being included in their fun and games, even if it did mean pushing myself that much harder physically in order to be included as one of the boys. We began to climb and climb and climb and climb what appeared to be a very steep, treacherous, mountainous elevation. It felt like we'd been hiking forever, and the sweat was pouring down my forehead, and my clothes were drenched with sweat, and I was breathing heavily. Luckily, we'd brought water bottles with us, so we sat down on the mountainous outcrop, and we enjoyed the view of the Appalachia from the high elevation while we hydrated ourselves. It was really idyllic, and our little home looked like a quaint tiny dot in the distance. It was a prime position to observe everything from hundreds of miles away. Suddenly I smelt the most disgusting smell that I've ever smelt in my whole life, and it wafted over to where we were sitting. It smelt like a rotting skunk and dead, decomposing flesh, and it was utterly revolting. We looked around for the source of the smell and could not find anything. As we continued to climb, I suddenly lost my footing and went tumbling into this little hollow, and fell onto the edge of a small opening that we discovered by chance led into a large cave. This was where the smell was emanating from. My brothers were incredibly excited to discover a huge cave in this mountainous outcrop, and so we proceeded to look around the cave for the source of the smell, expecting to find a dead body lying somewhere in the cave. We came across what appeared to be several large nests on the dirt floor, made up of mosses, grasses and leaves, and the area was so trampled down as if very big creatures like large bears had been lying on those beds. But these weren't the nests of large bears, I can assure you. There was also a pile of walnuts on the floor of the cave. It was curiously bizarre and exceedingly peculiar, to say the least. "Something is living in here," said my brother Robert, obviously stating the obvious. "You mean some things," corrected my brother Ethan. "It looks like 4 creatures are nesting in here, and whatever they are very big, judging by the size of the flattened grass on these nesting areas." We had lived in Appalachia all our lives, and couldn't make any sense of these nests at all that we had discovered, as they did not fit the profile of a bear or any other animal that we knew of. When I smelt the grassy beds, I realized that the ghastly smell emanated from the bedding, so it would appear that who or what was lying in the bed was the real source of the stench. "We need to come back here," said Robert, "another time when we're armed. I'm eager to find out what these creatures actually are," he said, with a broad beam developing on his face. Robert was exceedingly excited and intrigued, and was the most adventurous in our family, and simply loved resolving mysteries and puzzles. Ethan and Eric, on the other hand, were not as enthusiastic about this crazy idea, because they were much less spontaneous, and were so grounded that they didn't like to seek out things that could potentially be dangerous. "No, I think we need to leave these creatures well alone, because whatever they are, they're not small. They smell rank, and they could potentially be aggressive and very dangerous." That evening, after a long, tiring day of exploring, we all retired to bed very early, only to be awoken by these loud, thunderous bangs all around our home. Bear in mind, at the best of time, our house was not big, but we could tell that something really hefty was walking across our roof and appeared to be banging the timber beams. The commotion was so incredibly loud that all three of us kids and my mother snuggled together in the middle of the house, clutching each other in fear, while Ethan hung on to his Remington rifle with hands that were so tight I could see his knuckles had turned bright pink. Amidst this chaotic commotion and upheaval in our home, my stepfather was zonked out by too much moonshine and was snoring loudly on the couch, seemingly oblivious to the barrage of activity taking place outside our home. "What on earth is going on?" cried my mother. "Something is on our roof trying to terrorize us." She tried to wake up our stepfather, but he was like someone who was under a major anesthetic, because nothing seemed to rouse him. That moonshine had truly knocked him out. The banging on our roof was utterly relentless, but things got even worse as we could hear the loudest roars that were so utterly terrifying that even the china on my mother's dresser started to shake and vibrate, and a picture on the wall came crashing off, landing yards away from my stepfather, violently shattering, and glass went flying everywhere. Suddenly my stepfather woke up with a start, and in a drunken stupor he grabbed his rifle and stumbled to the door, yanking it open. "Those bloody bears," he said, rambling out of the house, wobbling precariously on his skinny legs due to the effects of the moonshine, which appeared to make him incredibly unstable on his feet. "Bert," my mother cried out, "get back in! There's something big and dangerous out there." It was too late. Bert hadn't listened, and my mother quickly slammed the door behind him because she was afraid those creatures would come running in. She immediately put the lamp outside on the ground to help Bert see what he was doing, as we had no outside lights in those days. She was so terrified that whatever was out there on the roof would come bolting back into the house. "The stupid, stupid man," I could hear my mother mumbling to herself. "I told him that moonshine would kill him. I told him, but he would never listen." Ethan was looking outside the window, and I could hear him saying, "What the heck is that?" So I scurried over to the window to observe what it was that Ethan was in fact looking at. Bert was there fumbling around with his rifle. He appeared confused, muddled, and very disorientated. He didn't seem to know one end from his rifle from the other, which was very odd. He was trying to defend himself from this monstrous black giant that literally bounced off our roof with the agility of a pussycat and came thundering towards Bert at record speed. Bert literally unloaded his rifle, but not into the creature as he had intended, but into his own chest. He fell back instantly and just lay there lifeless in a bloody heap on the ground. He had accidentally just killed himself in trying to defend himself against this curious animal that was about to attack him. The animal lifted Bert's deceased body into the air and threw it around several times in his large jumbo-sized hands, as if Bert was some kind of a soft toy. The creature was so colossal that he made Bert appear like a tiny rag doll. That's how pathetically small Bert actually appeared. I remember standing at the window. It was a full moon, and the light of our oil lamp outside made me see even more clearly. I was frozen and incapacitated by a fear that I have never known, so much so that I was literally incapable of moving a muscle. My heart was pounding in my chest so fast and so loud that I literally heard every single beat. I am certain that my eyes were as large as saucers and that my mouth was hanging open like a fly trap. I was unable to believe what I was actually witnessing with my eyes. I was almost certain I was going to awake from a horrifying nightmare, only to find that it was just some dreadful dream. This could not really have happened, could it? The creature was like a human giant. I know of no other way to describe him. I mean, Bert was 6 foot tall, but this creature towered over him by another 4 feet, so he could not have been less than 10 feet. He was 5 foot wide and easily over 1,000 pounds. He was so human-like in stature, only infinitely much larger, and he was covered from head to toe with 2-inch thick black hair. The creature had a bullet-shaped head that blended seamlessly into a large pair of beefy shoulders, larger than anything I've ever seen. The creature was just a mass of muscle definition, tone and solid brawn, and he was hefty, chunky, burly, and super strong. Everything about his body exuded power, strength, and dominance. Even though I could not tell he was a male because of the thick covering of hair, I assure you everything about this creature exuded testosterone on a very large scale. He was driven by anger, rage, and fury. I could tell that this critter, whatever it was, had very definite ape-like characteristics in its physical appearance that were notable in the overlong arms and very distinct brow ridge, flat nose, and grey leathery hairy face. Ethan and I watched in horror as this creature obliterated Bert's body, and I mean obliterated, by aggressively thumping it against our front door several times, like he was slamming a pole. And then he continued to climb on the roof, beating the panels violently until the dark night retreated and the early morning made its presence finally known. By that time the creature had vanished, and the whole house smelt of death and decay. When we opened the front door, we could not believe what we were seeing. We found Bert's body, bone, sinew, fat, and blood splattered against our front door, with pools of blood lying close to where he had accidentally shot himself. You would have thought that we would be howling and crying in dismay, but my whole family was so subdued and so quiet, and no one said a word. All was very, very still. We allowed the practicalities of daily life and cleaning up the gruesome mess and organising Bert's funeral to take precedence over our emotional state, which was a good thing. I think all the practicalities of running the home enabled us to suppress our emotional anguish, distress, and grief over what recently had transpired. The great thing about living in Appalachia is that you are never short of friendly neighbours to help you out in crisis situations, by making you meals, helping you clean up your place, and being there for you when you need them for a chat. Everyone was absolutely horrified about what had happened to Bert and how he'd accidentally killed himself, but the mysterious creature that had obliterated Bert's body after it was actually dead left my mother's friends very confused and alarmed about what this curious creature could have been that had hounded our family during the night. No one had any idea of what it was. One of my neighbours called a Native American elder to come and see us because she believed he knew many of the mysteries about Appalachia from his forefathers before him. Maybe he would make sense of this curious creature that we had encountered. The Native American was called White Feather, and when he arrived at our home his face was very solemn and serious, and we began to tell him all the details of our terrifying, grievous night, and how we had observed a giant ape-like humanoid that had attacked Bert after he'd killed himself by obliterating his body until he was just a mangled, runny mess of body fluids, bone and fat. "What have you done?" asked White Feather. "You must have done something to provoke the kahuna. What did you do?" "Nothing," we said. "We did nothing." "You did something to upset the kahuna," insisted White Feather. "Try and think." Ethan was green at the gills. "We did go hiking over the mountainous ridge over there, and we did find a cave with all these nests in there, but we never disturbed a thing, I promise." "This is very grave," said White Feather. "What you have done is highly offensive to the kahuna. You were intruding upon their private space. They are very territorial. They must have sensed and smelt your energy, so they came back to seek revenge, which was why you lost your stepfather so tragically." "Well, it was a mistake," I insisted. "Bert accidentally shot himself. I saw him do it. He was so drunk on that moonshine." "Is that what you think?" chuckled the native elder. "The kahuna know how to play mind games. They got Bert to kill himself. It was no accident. It looked that way, I'm sure." "Are they coming back to kill the rest of us?" I asked in horror. It was all my fault we stumbled on the cave in the first place, and I didn't mean anything by snooping around. We were just curious and very interested, that's all. We need to make some kind of restitution so that you're not all in danger. You need to make a formal apology to the kahuna. How are we going to do that? I asked. Those creatures will kill us before we even approach them, I'm sure of it. It amazes me how little you white people know about energy. Everything in this universe is energy, and we're going to use energy and vibration to apologize to the kahuna. And so it was when the golden tangerine sun set over the valley and the darkness rolled in over the horizon that White Feather gave a piece of timber to each one of us and instructed us all to use our minds to express our apologies to the kahuna by planting all our thoughts in the timber, which is exactly what we had to do. In other words, we needed to talk to our own piece of timber and express our sincere apologies. Once the timber was burnt, the smoke from the fire would be like a conveyor of our messages in the timber that the kahuna would be able to comprehend and read. I wanted to believe White Feather, but it seemed so crazy to me that a piece of timber that I spoke to with my mind once burnt would convey a message to the kahuna. However, I was willing to do anything to prevent that terrifying beast from ever coming back. I spoke to my timber in my mind and I said, "I'm so sorry. I really didn't mean to intrude upon your space and your territory. I was very curious and nosy, and I know I shouldn't have been. I meant you no harm, and I'm really, really sorry. Please don't hurt my family, especially since it's my fault." Once the fire was burning, my brother's mother and I placed our logs on the fire, while White Feather began to chant and to sing in a strange, curious tongue. We could see the smoke from our fire pit rising as our timber logs were burnt, and then we heard whooping sounds across the valley, in response to White Feather's strange chanting and the curious smoke that was created from the fire, which I have to tell you was different to the usual smoke we would see, and that was curious indeed. "I think we may have appeased the kahuna," he said, "but you will only know in the morning when they leave you a sign at your front door. If you receive that sign, they have chosen to forgive you." That night we were not disturbed by any commotion on our roof, which we were thankful for, but the following morning we were very apprehensive when we opened the front door. But we luckily found 4 feathers on our doorstep, so we knew at once that we had been forgiven by the kahuna. After that crazy event in my life returned to normal for us, but all these years later I realized that the kahuna are in fact the hairy humanoid that you call Bigfoot. I do know those creatures have the ability to read energy, to manipulate minds, and they have powers that we cannot even conceive of. They seem to tap into things beyond human understanding and comprehension, which may be why they manage to keep out of the shadows, so few of us actually get to see them. That is my story. I just want to thank you so very much for that incredible story. Wow, it's fascinating, that moonshine stuff. I've heard all about Appalachian moonshine, Andrea, and wow, that must be some stuff. I gather if you drink that moonshine, you need to be very cautious about how much you drink, because if Bert hadn't been so drunk, the situation could have ended up very differently. Until next time, goodbye and good night.